Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Bob Graham Center. I'm David Colburn, Director of the Bob Graham Center, and we're really pleased to have this program here for you tonight. One of the things I'd like to do before we begin, which is a bit unusual, is have a moment of silence. Walter Califf from Oak Hammock was one of our enormous supporters, would bring buses of people to our meetings, took our students in at Oak Hammock to work with the seniors there, supported our faculty. He died within the last 24 hours. So if you would, just a moment of silence for Walter. Thank you. We're delighted to have you here this evening, as we always are. And we think that tonight's program on Vietnam, a 50-year reflection, is particularly important for our our students that you hear about. They're young, but not that young. And they're awfully mature in lots of ways. This program tonight is a little different in format. We've got three panelists and our moderator, Matt Jacobs from the Department of History. Matt is a PhD in history and foreign relations, and he has taught on the Middle East, he's taught on Vietnam, he's taught on America and international affairs and foreign policy. And he's one of our terrific teachers. He's won the Teacher of the Year award 3 times. He will introduce our panelists. To say another word about the format, Matt will ask the questions tonight, and the panelists will engage in discussion. If you want to follow up after the evening's over, it lasts an hour. The panelists are willing to stay around and take your questions and have a conversation with you. So again, thank you for being here. Thanks for supporting this program. This was one of our more divisive periods, certainly the most divisive period in my lifetime, and perhaps a number of you as well. And I think our young people need to know something about it. So thanks again. Matt?
Thank you, David. And thank you to the Bob Graham Center and to the Oral History Program, Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, for sponsoring tonight's event, and for to each of our panelists as well for joining us this evening, being willing to share some of their thoughts on their experiences in Vietnam. I'm going to start with just about 5 minutes of comments just to try to place tonight in context and to help folks understand why are we doing a 50-year reflection in the year 2018. What was it about 50 years ago that matters to us today? And then I'll introduce each of the panelists, and they will speak for approximately 10 minutes to start with, and then I'll do some follow-up questions with them as well. And as David said, the event should last approximately an hour here. So I think the place to start is to realize that with the exception of the Civil War, Vietnam was and remains our most contested conflict. And that sounds a little odd to say that a war is contested, but Vietnam really is contested. It was contested domestically at the time, and it remains contested in the scholarly literature and the public discourse and the policy discussions about the conflict as well. And so I think it's important to try to understand why that's the case. So that's the first point I want us to think about. And there, Vietnam offers very little certainty for us, and Americans like certainty. But Vietnam doesn't have much of it to offer. Even if you ask the question, when did the Vietnam War begin? You get incredibly different answers to that question. Most Americans would say maybe the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, if they know about that, in August of 1964. Some might say July 1965, when the Johnson administration undertakes the series of meetings that lead to the massive deployments of troops going forward. But by the end of 1963, there were already 200 Americans who'd passed away in Vietnam. The first American death in Vietnam is 1956. By 1950, the United States is paying for 75% of a French war effort in Vietnam. So there's not even certainty about when you define the beginning of the Vietnam conflict. There's also not certainty about how we define the end of the Vietnam conflict. The treaties by which the Americans would withdraw are signed in early 1973. Most combat forces are out. American combat forces are out by early 1973. But the South doesn't fall until late April, early May of 1975. And the image that resonates with most Americans about the end of the war in Vietnam comes from that period. And it's the image that many of you have seen of Americans and others fleeing via the roof of the American embassy, being airlifted off by helicopter. Also, in terms of uncertainty, when we think of other wars, we think of those defining moments, those defining battles that might lead inexorably along that march to victory. If you want to think about World War II in the Pacific Theater, we've got the Battle of Midway and so on, Iwo Jima, etc. When you think about the European theater, we've got the North African campaign, the Italian campaign, D-Day, right? These defining moments that you can look at and say, this helped shape the war. Vietnam doesn't have those moments in the same way. Instead, we have the Battle of Ap Bac in 1963. We have the Battle of the Drang Valley in 1965. Battles that seem to present more ambiguity than clarity in certain respects. Tet is one of those moments. The Tet Offensive takes place at the end of January into February of 1968. That is why it's a 50-year reflection. This is the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. Tet, for those of you who don't know, is the Lunar New Year in Vietnam. Traditionally, there had been an informal peace, or truce, if you will, for a few days to allow those celebrations to take place. In 1968, the North Vietnamese, working with South Vietnamese resistance forces, decided to launch an offensive during that traditional truce period. And in that offensive, they're able to take over territories and villages, part of the Saigon airport. They enter the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon. Now, militarily, all of these are turned back over the coming days, weeks, and in the up north near the boundary, it takes about 6 weeks ultimately to overturn those, but they're all military victories on the U.S. and southern Vietnamese side ultimately, and military defeats for the resistance. It's devastating for the southern resistance. About 40,000, what we would call, or the American military would call VC or Viet Cong, are killed in those 2 months roughly. There are military defeats in that sense and victories on the American and the South Vietnamese side. Yet at the same time, they present more ambiguity because the defining image of that is a South Vietnamese colonel firing at point-blank range into the head of a Viet Cong member of the Viet Cong resistance who's defenseless with his hands bound behind his back, right? And so that leads to the question, is this what we're fighting for here? And then Walter Cronkite goes to Vietnam, and at the end of February, declares in an editorial at the end of a broadcast that Vietnam has become a stalemate, to which Lyndon Baines Johnson, president at the time, says, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America. So that defines why we're looking at this moment, why we're using this as a point of reflection, a 50-year reflection. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't point out this vital fact. Everything that we're going to be talking about tonight will be from an American perspective. That's appropriate. We're an American audience, right, for the most part. But recognize that as much complexity as you will hear about on the American side exists on the Vietnamese side or sides. And one of the things when I teach the Vietnam War as a class, the first day of class I asked the students, what did the Vietnamese call the Vietnam War? That's an interesting question to ask that forces them suddenly to realize, wait a second, intuitively they know that they would not call that the Vietnam War, right? But they don't know what they would call it. And the answer is it's the American War. And that's both because that's who they're fighting in that phase, but it's also because it's one war for the Vietnamese in a series of wars, fighting the French anti-colonial war, fighting the Japanese during World War II, fighting the French from 46 to 54, a war in which the French lost 75,000 and the Vietnamese lost somewhere around 600,000 to 700,000, fighting the Americans, fighting the Cambodians, then fighting the Chinese. The American War is one piece of decades worth of conflict. So we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize also, while we will be talking about the American experiences in Vietnam, we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize those different perspectives that we must also acknowledge here. All right, so I wanted to just sort of do that to provide some context. As I said, each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have some questions afterwards. We're actually going to start with Cornelius Clayton, who's here in the middle. Cornelius was actually deployed in 1967 for about 7.5 months, was actually wounded on Veterans Day in 1967. So he is deployed literally just as we're beginning to understand what Vietnam would come to be called as a meat grinder, right, where it's just starting to grind up American soldiers and Vietnamese as well. He's going to speak first, and then we'll have Mary Bahr speak, who was deployed beginning in 1968, right after Tet, or perhaps even during Tet, depending on exactly how we want to define it. And then retired Lieutenant General John LeMoyn, who was deployed at different moments throughout Vietnam, and will wrap up with some reflections as well. So Cornelius, if you'll start for about 10 minutes, and your mic should go live, I think.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to be here. I'm gonna have to be very brief. It's kind of hard to do a 10-minute thing about your tour over there, which was 6.5 months. But I'm gonna read it very briefly. I arrived in Vietnam in 1967. And that was the beginning of the monsoon season. It rained every day. We get wet at night. We sleep cold and all that kind of stuff. We were flown into Pleiku. That was my base camp with the 4th Division, and they orientated us about the in-country, and then they flew us out in the jungles, where I stayed there for like 6.5 months. Actually, I got wounded after 6.5 months. But we patrolled the jungles, and sometimes we would set into a fire support base and just have a little bit of fun. We couldn't have a whole lot of fun. But anyway, after we was over there, we learned what we had to do if we was setting up somewhere. We had to dig bunkers and cut down trees to make overhead protection just in case the enemy decide to mortar us. And the living life was not all good. Sometimes we had to wear our clothes for days because we could not get a change of clothes. If we ran into a stream, we would get in the stream and just wash clothes and all. They just didn't have enough stuff, to change us out, like not every day, but like on a regular basis. Sometimes we didn't get food because maybe it was the monsoon was so heavy that the helicopters could not see, and the fog was heavy. Combat action was not good. We lost a lot of men. Thanks to have a good government. And I say, I like to reach back in religion a little bit. I say, thank God for the Air Force who came in and did airstrikes and dropped bombs when we got pinned down and dropped napalm. And a lot of us wouldn't have been here today if it hadn't have been for the Air Force doing that. There was a time when 12 soldiers went out on a patrol. They didn't quite make it back before they was ambushed by the enemy. And we got them out. We had to load them up on a helicopter. We stacked them on top of each other like they was hogs, but we had to get our friends out of there. Helicopters, that was my first this battle was my first bad battle. We did things that we wouldn't normally do. We had the enemy that was killed by the United States. We usually don't bury their dead, but they was in an area that the United States had a convoy coming through, so we had to bury them, the ones that was in the wood line, but the one was out by the road. They had a big tank with a scrape on it. They scraped a hole in a ditch, and covered them up. I think I could just about eat lunch or whatever around just about any kind of smell, I think, because we had to go back there and where we buried those human remains. It was a smelly time, but the sergeant said, let's eat, so you don't question him. We ate. My best buddy, this is in 1967, when I got wounded. But when I got wounded, he got blown to pieces because the enemy dropped a couple of rounds in on us. And it was what I was trained for, which was mortars, but they made me a rifleman when I got there. And it really tore me to pieces because we slept in the same hooch, me and Mo guys. And, it was like it was one-on-one. But I'm going to close it out by saying thank God that for the helicopters and all the people that got us out after it had cooled down, and they took us to the hospital. And after the hospital, they cleaned our wounds out, and they flew us into Japan. So my time over there was 6.5 months that I was over there. So I'll close out now.
Mary, if you'd like to continue now. Mary Bahr served in intelligence was deployed for a year, ended up coming back with a Strategic Air Command in Nebraska, became a science teacher, and now lives here in Gainesville as a retired science teacher. So Mary, if you'd like to.
Thank you. I think one thing you'll see is my every experience in a war is unique, and I think mine is quite different from what you'll hear otherwise. I joined the Air Force in 1967. I was teaching, and I had kids in the Civil Air Patrol, and I wanted to travel, so I certainly traveled. I went to San Antonio for training and was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and they sent me to Denver for 8 months of training in the Air Force Intelligence School there, right in downtown Denver. I trained as a photo interpreter using satellite photography. There were only 2 places in the U.S. that were doing this at that time, and one was in Denver and one was in Washington, D.C. We were up on the second floor of the building, and between classes, we could walk out on this balcony and watch the protesters against the war. And they picked our building as a place to protest. And if you look carefully, you often saw former classmates amongst the protesters. At that time, at 22 years old, I had no idea why they did what they did. You can see I'm wearing a shirt that I certainly have kind of changed my view, but I wasn't political at all at that point. We had a month of training with the CIA, and one thing I do remember is that when they talked about Ho Chi Minh, they revered him. They said he was a great man. And for me, that was there was a disconnect between that and what you heard on the news. And that was intriguing to me and still is. I graduated from intelligence school in July of 1968 and was assigned to the headquarters, Air Force headquarters in Vietnam, which was at the big air base by Saigon called Tan Son Nhut. I went in country in late summer, I believe it was late August actually, after Tet, but I know you mentioned, I kind of looked up, well, how long was Tet? And some people say Tet was still going on, but it wasn't as intense as it had been the first month or so. The thing that we heard as we landed was take off your insignia, and because the snipers will shoot the officers first, so that was my first introduction to a war zone. I was walking on base, and somebody was riding a bike next to me, and his tire blew, And there was a big crowd of people, and everybody hit the road, including somebody pushed me down because I didn't have the sense to go. So there was still a fear at that point about snipers around the base during the day. It was a really different environment, so radically so that I was sick for a month and some of my hair fell out, which wasn't so bad. I had too much of it anyway. But I was walking, the monsoon came, and I was walking down the road in about ankle-deep water. We walked everywhere, and by the way, women weren't allowed to drive on base or carry guns, so unless I could hitch a ride, I walked. And I walked right into a ditch, and I was suddenly neck-deep in water. So that's the kind of how different it was from living in the States. We were allowed initially for about the first month to live in Cholon, which was, we rented a place. And I actually came over there in country to the same base with a good friend from intelligence school. And she was an Army brat. Her dad had been a master sergeant. He was retired at that time. And so we rented a house in Cholon. And we stayed there about a month. It had a great flat roof you could go out on in the evening. And then there was a grenade attack. They threw a grenade into a bus, and another Air Force woman who lived in Cholon was injured, and they moved us onto base, and we moved into bunkered housing. You had shoulder-high sandbags all the way around the building. We all had our own little room, so we had privacy. But we were enduring, by that time, nightly rocket attacks on the base. And as you may know, the Viet Cong pretty much were active during the night. And we kind of lived in defended islands, especially at night. One of my sergeants was killed in one of those rocket attacks. It just was a dead hit on his barracks. I worked for a colonel, a lieutenant colonel. He spoke fluent Chinese and Vietnamese. And it was pretty boring. Initially, we declassified documents, which is not my favorite thing to do. But he was a very interesting character, and looking back on him, he possibly could have been a spy with his fluency in languages. I know he did interrogate people. We went downtown with him once a week to a Catholic orphanage, and we would play with the kids, and he would teach the kids English. Many of the kids were missing limbs, but they still loved to play foosball. My friend had friends of her dad stationed on the perimeter of the base about this time, and we went out to visit them. It was one of the few times that I got out other than into Saigon or flying in a helicopter somewhere, because I used to hitch rides on helicopters just to go places. Remember, I was only 23 by this time, so not a lot of sense. But we went out to visit them, and these two guys, they literally lived on the perimeter of the base. And we got to talking about Tet, and they said, yeah, their opinion was that Tan Son Nhut came very close to being overrun by the Viet Cong. That was their experience. They were there defending the base at the time. On the way, when we went into town to the orphanage, there were sidewalk villages in Saigon where refugees literally lived on the curbs, cooked on the curbs. Saigon's population had grown from 1.2 million before the war to between 3 and 4 million during the war because of the destruction of the countryside. I know even when we went out to visit the guys on the perimeter, there were all these bombed out houses on the perimeter of the base. On the American side, we visited the medevac about once a week, which maybe you went, did you go through Saigon? Yeah. So we would just go visit with the guys, and I'll never forget one young man. He was celebrating his 21st birthday. The nurses had a cake and candles. They turned off the lights, and all you could see was this mass of white bandages where his face had been. It had been destroyed by a landmine. For years, I didn't tell that story. I thought, oh, that's too gruesome. I'm going to keep that to myself. But now I tell it because I think people need to stop romanticizing war, especially to young people. This is what really happens. The last half of my tour, I worked with the air crews publishing a weekly intelligence summary to try and help them survive their flights over the north. Some flight school classes lost as many as 75% of their graduates, but these guys all loved to fly and they fought to go, even though they were risking their lives. That experience really shaped my view of the war. I focused on how to better keep these guys who became my friends alive. Every time we had a ceasefire over the north, usually for political reasons, all the SAM sites, surface-to-air missile sites, and all the anti-aircraft sites were moved around. We no longer knew where they were. And when the crews went back in, which we kept going back and forth, there was slaughter. So that made me angry. I thought that was not good policy. But you're in the military, you follow orders. We actually used drones back then with cameras. They were flown from aircraft carriers to gather intelligence. No missiles. They hadn't thought of arming them yet. And I used a lot of drone and satellite photography in my intelligence summary every week for the air crews. I worked in the USAF headquarters on Tonsanut. My boss was General Brown. He was a pilot, and he would get his flight hours over North Vietnam. A lot of people behind his back said this was irresponsible because he knew so much if he was shot down. He was campaigning to become the chair of the Joint Chiefs. He asked for satellite and drone photos to support his plan for the war because his plan for the war was to bomb the Viet Cong supply lines into the south. We sent him some photos that showed trucks driving around bomb craters, and he sent them back, telling us to send him different photos. He did get the job. This, to me, illustrates the general attitude I found in Saigon. And remember, I was kind of in middle management, you might say. Everyone was really busy taking care of themselves. There was no mission other than survival and profit. And again, I'm speaking from my position. I don't believe that was true of everybody there. I met a woman my age at an embassy party one night, and her name was Frances Fitzgerald. We had a conversation about why the Americans were there. I told her I could not discern a mission other than staying alive and profiting, both on the part of Americans and Vietnamese that I knew in Saigon. She told me she was writing a book. When I got home, I read her book, Fire in the Lake, which won a National Book Award and a Pulitzer. The big message from Fire in the Lake for me was that we had not gotten involved in a civil war between a democracy in the South and communists in the North. Rather, we were on the wrong side in a revolutionary war where the Vietnamese were defending their homeland. And this is one reason I'm now wearing this shirt. I wouldn't have done that back in Vietnam, but I certainly have a different view today. But all my experiences in Vietnam support it. All these experiences at age 23 shaped my view today of the war. I'm a member of Vets for Peace, Chapter 14, here in Gainesville. The fellowship with veterans and what I've learned by participating in our yearly projects has helped me process the Vietnam experience. We do a peace poetry project that is going on right now, and we celebrate International Day of Peace ceremony in September every year. These are exercises in thinking about peaceful projects and rewards. In 1968, Martin Luther King was criticizing the Vietnam War. One of the things he said was, every time we drop our bombs in North Vietnam, and this may have been a little later, President Johnson talks eloquently about peace. What is the problem? They are talking about peace as a distant goal, as an end we seek. But one day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal we seek, but it is a means by which we arrive at that goal. For the last 7 years, I've worked on the Cost of War project as part of the Memorial Mile display. We analyze how much the war is costing taxpayers and show what we could do with the money instead. And this is actually a national project called the National Priorities Project. Here's an example. The DoD budget cost for Gainesville in tax dollars is over $144 million. Now, this would be the current wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The same tax dollars would have provided over 8,000 four-year scholarships for University of Florida students. We also show other costs to families and to veterans' health. I personally have a chronic form of leukemia that the DoD says is connected to exposure to Agent Orange, the defoliant that we used in Vietnam. I wrote about it in one of my weekly summaries for the air crews. I interviewed a sergeant who loaded the planes at Tan Son Nhut with Agent Orange. He claimed it was perfectly safe and that you could bathe in it. I warned him that I'd seen classified research that said otherwise. It is now connected with multiple disabilities in veterans and terrible deformities and birth defects for both Vietnamese and American veterans' children. I wanted to give you these examples from my war experience of how, to quote MLK, destructive means cannot bring constructive ends. I believe in Martin Luther King's vision of a peaceful, just world brought about by peaceful means. Just imagine what our world could be like if we had peace for 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So now I'll turn to Lieutenant General Retired John LeMoyn, who served for 37 years in the military. He's from Gainesville and has returned to Gainesville in his retirement. So, Lieutenant General
LeMoyn. I'm a Gainesville boy and dropped out of the University of Florida, enlisted in the Army Special Forces program, and went through the training and then came back to university to finish my degree. And I missed it. Jumping out of airplanes is better than heroin. There's a rush to that. But also you're serving with people that you trust and depend on. And the war broke out, as Matt said earlier, and I felt a responsibility to join my buddies who I'd trained with and go serve. So I went to ROTC and volunteered. Got into Vietnam in the spring of '69. And I really hit it at a very fortunate time because, as Matt mentioned in his introduction, the VC were essentially dead. Militarily, it was a crushing defeat for the VC and the NVA. And in fact, Ho Chi Minh asked the Politburo leadership not to do the Tet Offensive. He thought that they could win it other ways. And so they sent him out of country. So my tour there, I had the benefits of all the combat action before that. A couple of things I'll say to kind of set that tone, though. Ken Burns gave a special on the Vietnam War a few months back, and let me paraphrase one of his comments there. There's no single one truth about war, and I don't know of a single war that's nice. Big wars, little wars, independence wars, conquest wars, none of them are nice. And for the families involved, they're all disastrous. And that's just a historical effect there. I first served with the Vietnamese Airborne Division, based out of Tan Son Nhut, and we were the fire brigade for the South Vietnamese military. The cadre of the paratrooper division were trained by the French, and were very, very professional. The Vietnamese airborne that I served with for 6 months were the single most professional, combat-ready military force I saw in all Southeast Asia. Better than any NVA, better than any American unit, better than any other nations there. Very professional. Never saw them murder anybody. They never burned any villages. They were just tough fighters. And the NVA knew that. And the time I served with them next to Cambodia, we got in major fights about every month with NVA regiments. And then I was able to transfer because my position was eliminated during the drawdown criteria for Nixon. And so I didn't want to go back to Tan Son Nhut or Long Binh. And so I volunteered. I asked if I could go to an American unit. And so I transferred to an American unit and was a reconnaissance platoon leader for 4 days, and then took over a rifle company for the next 5.5, 6 months. Again, in the Three Corps area, close to Cambodia most of that time. The tragedy of our war in Vietnam was it was based on deceit, and deceit by every party involved in that conflict, by the North, by the South, by the neighbors, by the Americans, by the peace accords, by all of them. And a lot of American youth suffered from that. We had 47,000 killed in combat. We had over 10,000 killed by accidents, suicides, murder, drug overdose, and illness. In hindsight, was it worth it? I must say that the South Vietnamese Americans who have come back to our nation, I go to their reunion every year. They are fiercely proud to be Americans, despite the fact that we sold them out in the Paris Peace Accords. And also, if you look at it, Matt, I'll just tell you that Vietnamese Americans have changed the communist government because the money and influence that they've sent back to their family members down south has changed the communist economy. After 20 years of 5-year plans, they quit trying to change the economy. And the south part of Vietnam is just bustling, just booming. And so it's kind of refreshing to see how things change after, 47 years to do that. But I came home and wore my uniform and had no unpleasant experience. I got warned a couple of times by airline attendants and so on. I said, but that's all right. And landed at Gainesville Airport, and the guy next to me, who had not said a word from Atlanta, he said, is somebody going to meet you at the airport? And I said, no, my wife's teaching school, and I wasn't able to call her from Atlanta. He said, I'll just get a cab. And he said, well, I'll give you a ride. And so a long-haired hippie professor at the University of Florida drove this combat boy back to his wife's apartment. And the things I saw in Vietnam were so different from the Army that I joined. It made me angry. Angry enough to where I wanted to be part of changing it. And I met enough good, sincere Americans who felt the same way. And so I stayed and wrapped up almost 40 years of military service. And I'm proud of it. Worked hard. Got fired twice. Had my rights read to me once. But I always follow the rule of, is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it moral? And if it meets that criteria, don't have any doubts no matter what the other orders say. And sir, with that, I'll close out.
Thank you very much, John. So thank you, all of you, for your sharing your perspectives on the conflict in its many different forms. A lot of different things come out of that, actually. And one thing that certainly Cornelius and Mary mentioned, and John, you may have some reflections on this as well, is the role of technology. Mary, you mentioned drones. You both mentioned helicopters. Helicopters transformed conflict, and it not only transformed the way that you fought conflict, but it also transformed the way that you dealt with the wounded. And you see this a little bit earlier in the world, a little bit near the end of World War II, Korea, you see it more. But I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit more about the role of technology. And Mary, you mentioned the chemical side of technology as well, with things like Agent Orange. By the way, there was Agent Red, Agent Blue, all defined by the color of the container that they were in. Because the liquids were all clear. That's how you could distinguish between the different defoliants and so on. So I wonder if you could each talk a little bit more about the role of technology. And I've got a range of questions for us to go through here too, but if you've got any more thoughts on that at all.
Well, the reason that,
Yeah, you're going to need to use the mic.
The reason that Agent Orange, in case you don't know, one of my background, I'm a chemist and a biologist by training. When Agent Orange was produced, it was produced at high temperatures, and a side product was dioxin, which is one of the most toxic chemicals on Earth that we've made. And it was there in tiny quantities, but it was apparently enough to cause some real damage to certainly the people underneath it in the jungles and the villages. because they used it to defoliate so that they could see the enemy. So we dropped it from planes. We did fly out of Tonsanut to do it. I would love to know what happened to the sergeant I had that conversation with. I'd also like to know why the studies that showed it caused cancer were classified, and I couldn't talk to, I could talk to my air crews about them, and I did warn them, but I couldn't talk to him. I didn't know what his clearance was. So I find that disturbing.
Cornelius, do you want to?
Well, I think that the Agent Orange was good for the foliage, but not for the troops. And being in infantry, you're always beating through the jungles. And I am a diabetic from it came 40 years after I got back. Because all you got to do is scratch your arm on a limb, and 40 years later, whatever, you got it. And I wish they had known how deadly it was for the troops. As a matter of fact, my neighbor, he had a prostrate operation. He's with the first cab, and it really messes up a lot of lives. And since I've been out and thinking about a lot of things with the chemicals, I'll say this: war is a money-making thing. A lot of times people know, like the chemical, what's going to happen to a lot of these people. But because the people back in the United States are making money, they still dropping the chemicals. Now, I say them were spraying, but at the time I didn't know what they were spraying. They didn't spray us, but as long as they sprayed the jungles. If it killed the foliage, what you think it'll do for the human beings? So you go ahead.
I walked through a lot of areas that have been defoliated, and I was happy to walk through the defoliated areas because they couldn't lay ambushes and so on. I had no idea about the effects of Agent Orange or the dioxin. And I'm sure some bureaucrat made that decision. For technology, I'll just tell you, I love helicopters. I thank God for American artillery, and I'll always buy an Air Force fighter pilot a drink because they saved my life more than once. I spent 12 months humping the boonies, and didn't have to hump the mountains like Corny did, but yeah, that's right. The technology saved an awful lot of American lives.
Right. In the helicopters, in terms of bringing people out who in earlier wars would have died on the battlefield with their injuries. Of course, another aspect of that, though, is it also transforms the Veterans Affairs system, as I was hinting at earlier, and I want to give each of you a chance to talk also about your experiences as veterans, too, because you don't, I was born in 1971, so I did have a brother who was in the military in Vietnam, but, for me, I was not in the military. I did not serve in war, but you don't serve in a war and then just have it, when your deployment ends, that's the end of your experience. You have a lifelong experience, whether it's through injuries, whether it's through the mental side of it, whether it's through dealing with friends, whatever. So I want to make sure that you each have an opportunity to talk a little bit about your experience as veterans here as well. So, John, do you want to start? And we'll just go the other direction this time.
Okay. I've had very good experience here with the VA, and because I have a Purple Heart, I can get service there, and Tom, I appreciate that. But they've been very professional, and I read the newspapers like everybody does, and I kind of scratch my head a bit. In fairness to the Secretary for Veteran Affairs, up until the recent changes, the regional directors didn't work for him. He couldn't fire him. He couldn't tell him what to do. And so General Rick Shinseki, who's one of the most honorable human beings on the face of this earth, took the heat for that. But I've had very good experience with Veteran Affairs here. And to kind of put it in context, almost 3 million Americans served in Vietnam from 1954 to 73, 75. In the 2000 census, 9 million Americans claim they served in combat in Vietnam. And the truth of the matter is, of the 2.7 million that actually did serve on the ground during that conflict, 90% of them never left a base camp, never carried a loaded weapon, never got in a firefight, never slept in the rain, never lived in the mud. Most of them worried about clean sheets, what was in the hot meal for the night, and what was on the movies. The Vietnam veterans coming out, if you listen to the hand-wringers, are all broken people, drug addicts, and homeless. The facts of the matter is that your Vietnam veterans have a higher percentage of income, personal income, than non-veterans, a higher education level, partly because of GI Bill, a lower suicide rate, a lower unemployment rate compared to the American population, and the list kind of goes on with that. So it's not all doom and gloom and wring your hands about how terrible it was for the individuals that served there. Most of us were just sincere, good young men and women trying to do the best we could in a bad situation, and came home and got on with their lives.
Cornelius?
I got PTSD from serving in Vietnam. It's better now after 50 years than it was. I may get a little emotional, but I'll get to it, okay? As a matter of fact, when I got wounded in 1967 and went to the hospital in Japan, the PSD started then, and the severe headaches. Real bad. When I was in the hospital, I used to go in the bathroom and sit down. I didn't tell nobody what was going on. It was a bad experience for me, an experience that I had never dealt with. But through it all, and it took many, many years of trying to deal with the situation at the time. I had crawling in my head. It felt like something was crawling in my head. I tried to hide it from people, because I didn't want to think I was going crazy, but he was about to drive me crazy. But anyway, while I was in Vietnam, when I got back stateside, they sent me to psychiatrists, psychologists, but they didn't know what was really going on with the PTSD. But really, they were denying that you was having a problem. And I tell people today, by being denied from the V, I don't have no complaints now. But then, they made things worse. And I tell people, I didn't do drugs before I went. I didn't do alcohol. I didn't smoke. But all the stuff that was going on in my head, PTSD, from the wall, if I was somebody drinking, I would have been out there driving late because I couldn't sleep. I have a sleeping problem now, but it's been so long, my body have adapted to it. It was really hard. Like I said, the psychiatrist, he didn't see what the problem was. Psychologists didn't see what the problem was. And really, it was hard for me to maintain and think of things that I know I was supposed to be able to do. It really arranged my life. And while I was home, I was really trying to hide it from people. I really didn't talk to it too much. I moved out by myself. I felt like I was in Vietnam again. I slept with my gun. I slept with it in Vietnam too, but at home I slept with it under my pillow. I just felt like I had to have it to be protected. I don't have to do that now. But so it's been a lot of change that come on. But I also put in there that because of God, a lot of praying by me and a lot of praying by other people, that I made it through. Because I tell you, the stuff that I went through in my head, I could have blown my brains out but I'm glad that God kept me on this side. And I thank him. I thank him all the time. And I tell people, and I'm gonna tell you guys this too, and I'm gonna let somebody else talk. If I hadn't made it back here, I would have never. Most of you people I don't know anyway. You would have never got a chance to meet me or see me. But you know, God have a reason for leaving you here. There were other things in the family to help or whatever. But I'm so glad that God allowed me to be in the midst of you guys one more time. Now, you guys don't know me. I get a little emotion sometimes when I'm talking about this. But I'm a guy that always, this lady on the front row, she know me. I'm a guy that always trying to make somebody happy or make them laugh when they're sad. That's just me. And so I try to give my joy to somebody else, and if it's another veteran, he's having a problem, unless he's a strong veteran, I don't share my problem with him. I try to pull him up, because there's a lot of veterans out there, they will not seek help. But I mean, I seek help, and it helped me, and I held in there. And I've had psychiatrists to say, if you ever need me, I got a psychiatrist today called Dr. Quatros. He always tell me, if you need me, call me, because he know if I call the office, oh, he booked up, we can't get you in. But I've never had to call him and tell him that I need to come in to see him, because I've been a strong fighter, and I hope I'll be a strong fighter. I don't have to fight as hard now, because things not like they were. But now I'll let somebody else speak, okay?
Mary, do you have any reflections?
Thank you very much. I am so glad that we are beginning to allow people to be honest about the problems they're having, because I think I think we, the military and downplayed these problems so long. I've seen them in Vets for Peace. We had a lot of Iraq vets who exhibited PTSD, one who was in the Battle of Fallujah who has very serious problems with it. And I have a family member who, as a civilian, had a really traumatic experience. And when they started describing what was happening to them, I said, you have PTSD, because I knew it from my friends in Vets for Peace. My own experience was more like the one that you described, John, that, I had a clean bed to sleep in. We had rocket attacks, but I think I was too young and foolish to really realize. I know my parents worried, but so as for the VA, I have found it wonderful. It does an amazing job. The people there are so dedicated. There's a women's clinic in the VA now, or there has been the whole time I've gone, and I have a general practitioner there who's amazing, and she wants to work in the VA. That was her choice, and she does a great job. So I feel like the care I've gotten there has been excellent. One of the things that Veterans for Peace is very concerned about is there's a push to privatize the VA, which apparently would shutter our hospitals, and that's a terrible idea. So I'm hoping that will go away, but I know the National Vets for Peace organization is campaigning against that. Our veterans need those services, and they need services that are specifically tailored to them, because they have their own special experiences, as Cornelius has told you about here, that need special care. So I'm hoping the VA stays around. I certainly use it. It's my primary care. Thank you.
John had asked if he could make a follow-up comment.
If I may, before I forget it for a third time, particularly for the students in the audience, read the book, A Bright Shining Light. It is the single best historical, factual layout of the Vietnam War, despite the misperceptions and the anecdotal data you'll get. It's extraordinarily well researched, and I think those of us that have been there at various times will tell you from their viewpoint, very factual, very well done. If I could touch on PTSD a bit. I've been a soldier a long time, and I've worked with 6 other foreign armies. And now I do volunteer work with the student veterans here at U of F in Santa Fe. PTSD became very popular. In my talking to the medical experts, and I can't even spell expert, but PTSD or PTS is a very normal human event. The emotions we go through with a death in the family, a severe accident, illness, or combat, creates stress in us. And most of us internalize that and rack and stack it and handle it. And in most cases, come out of it stronger because of that context. There is a percentage that we have not been able to figure out. And I agree with Mary that medically we don't quite know what it is, how it is, or how to treat it. And so we tend to treat symptoms and not the issue. But most people come out of this much better off once they rationalize it down inside their conscience. Most of the PTSD claims that you hear are by people who never served in combat, never left the base camp, never got in a fight. And in many cases, I have 100% disability because we don't know how to diagnose it. We don't know how to treat it. So the simple answer is we just approve it and let them go. Thank you.
We've got just a couple minutes left here. If you were taking notes, Bright Shining Light, authors Neil Sheehan, the subtitle is about Colonel John Paul Vann, who's the main focus of that book. And so again, it's a wonderful read. I had to read it back as an undergraduate, and I've assigned it to students as well. And Neil Sheehan was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, wrote multiple books on Vietnam as well. So as I said, we've got just a couple minutes left. I wanted to give each one of you a brief opportunity to make sort of a closing statement, if you wish. If there are any final points that we haven't touched on that you want to get across, we don't have a lot of time, so they need to be brief. But if you do have a final point, Cornelius, you've been going in the middle. I'll let you go first this time, and then I'll go to the edges. So if you have any final statements you'd like to make.
I just, I tell people from my experience, a lot of bad experience, that even if it make me feel a little bit emotional, if I can help somebody and educate them a little bit about the experiences that I had, that it might help them or might help somebody else along the way. And I get lost for words. But anyway, I have talked to some young, kids in elementary school. I mean, their eyes wide open with some of the stuff that I told them. I didn't share a lot of that with you guys because our time is limited. I also talked with high school students in Interlochen, Florida. But I just like to open up and give myself to somebody. I don't want anybody to get wrong picture of me because I say I got PTSD. I'm not crazy. I'm cool. I'm cool with it. I make you laugh. I make you do whatever, But I've grown to be stronger. And most of the time, I hid a lot of what I could hide. Or at least I thought I was hiding from people. But anyway, I'm just glad that I could be on this panelist tonight to just come and share just a little of what I experienced from that. And I'll say about the VA, now I have no complaints, but in the past I had complaints because they denied us when we were having pain problems. psychological problem, whatever kind of problem. But I do not have any negative things to say about the VA.
Mary? Mary?
So I would also like to recommend A Bright Shining Light. It's one of my favorite books. There's a organization in Sarasota called Veterans for Common Sense, and they had a women's veterans conference, the first one in the country. And I went down and ended up at the end of the conference sitting in a room full of other women and men intelligence officers who had served in Vietnam, and that's where I got the recommendation for the job. And the people that are portrayed in it are, many of them are in the intelligence services. I guess for me, I'm going to go back to that message that Martin Luther King gave, and his nonviolence did work for him in the South, and it's worked in other places. And if we want to build a peaceful society, we've got to do it in a peaceful way. War just makes it worse. And so, again, think about what our world would be like if we had 100 years of peace. Thank you.
I'd just like to reassure you. The Gallup poll every year does a survey of American population about our institutions in our society and so on, and they rack and stack them. And historically, year after year, your U.S. military is the single institution with the most trust and confidence by the American public. It's kind of surprising sometimes. And sir, do you know where university professors are on that?
Not high.
You're ranked third. The Congress is the lowest, followed by lawyers. But they do that every year. And my point to you is that we have earned that trust and confidence because despite our mistakes, we tend to address them and take corrective action, unlike many institutions that cover things up. Now, the good news is we're a human organization. The bad news is we're a human organization. And so it'll never be perfect. It'll never be exactly right. But your Army today is the single most professional Army in the history of our nation, the most highly educated, the most standards based upon what's right as opposed to what's convenient in our history. And we work very hard to police our ranks and clean things up. American youth today, over 2/3 of them do not qualify for military service, either due to lack of education, criminal record, they're obese, or in drugs. And so those that enlist in your military today are in your upper 1/3 to 25 percentile of the American youth population. 98% of them are high school graduates. And as an ex-personnel guy in the Army, I'll tell you there's a value to taking some non-high school graduates occasionally, because throughout our history, we've got people who have not finished school that did very, very well. So the opportunity there is the military still gives our society an opportunity to progress and change their social standard and so on. It works very well. And sir, thank you very much for tonight. Sugar, it was good talking to you. Okay. And Mary, nice to meet you.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the panelists. Again, I want to thank the Graham Center and the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. I would leave you with a couple final thoughts. First, as this demonstrated, again, to reiterate a point each of them made in their own way, there was no single Vietnam experience for American military folks deployed to Vietnam. There was no one Vietnam War for the United States, for the Vietnamese, et cetera. And there never is a single war experience, to again reiterate a point that John made. The other point I want to end on is beginning where I started, with the ambiguity and the contested nature of Vietnam. And I would ask you to reflect very briefly, as you depart on the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. You may or may not know how that came to pass. There was a contest that was, Maya Lin was selected as the winner with the winning design. Maya Lin was, of course, of Asian descent, and there was a lot of debate. How could you have someone of Asian descent, Asian American descent, design the memorial for a war that did not go so well for Americans in Asia? That led to the protests and debate over that led to the second Vietnam War memorial, which is the three soldiers, quote, emerging from the bush, which then generated protests because that didn't represent the women's experience, which led to a third Vietnam War memorial of women off, and all these are right next to each other in Washington, D.C. along the mall. Yet all the debates, all the contestation over the war itself and over the monument, if you look at Gallup polling now, which monument in Washington, D.C. is the most revered? You do have Johnson and Lincoln sitting at the top, but next it's the Vietnam Memorial. The wall in particular, which all of you have seen images of if you haven't been there, is considered the most emotionally powerful of the monuments. So even though we continue to debate what the Vietnam War was about, what it meant, what lessons we might take from it, there has been some consensus that has emerged over how we come to remember at least those who served. And this presents an opportunity to recognize, again, through these three individuals, the rest of the population of folks who served. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity to sit up here and to share and hear your reminiscences about the experience. And it's part of a vital opportunity for us to revisit the Vietnam War 50 years after a seminal event in the very middle of the conflict, and the year in which the most Americans died. 1968 was the deadliest year for Americans in Vietnam as well. So thank you very much to all of you. I appreciate it. And if you wish to ask questions individually, I believe you